31 people have been executed in Arkansas. This is part 1 of the series. John Edward Swindler, June 18, 1990, electrocution. At around 5 p.m. on Friday, September 24, 1976, Swindler shot and killed patrolman Randy Bassnett at a service station located across from the Arkansas State Police headquarters in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Officer Bassnett had stopped at the station when Swindler, who was wanted for a double homicide and multiple other felonies in Georgia and South Carolina, pulled in. Earlier that day, officers from the Fort Smith Police Department had been briefed with information about Swindler, including details about his crimes, the car he was driving, and the warning that he was armed and extremely dangerous. After spotting Swindler, Officer Bassnett radioed dispatch to report his location and request backup. However, before additional officers could arrive, Swindler reached into his car as if to retrieve his driver's license, but instead pulled out a handgun. He opened fire on Officer Bassnett, hitting him twice in the chest before jumping back into his stolen vehicle and speeding away. As Swindler fled, Officer Bassnett managed to fire 6 shots at the vehicle, 2 of which struck Swindler, while the other 4 hit the car. Swindler was later found and arrested in a wooded area east of the scene. When officers apprehended him, he was carrying multiple firearms and several hundred rounds of ammunition. Officer Bassnett succumbed to his injuries while being transported to Sparks Regional Medical Center. Years later, a 1983 legislative act established lethal injection as Arkansas's official method of execution. However, inmates who had been sentenced to death prior to that law were given the option to choose between electrocution and lethal injection. While another inmate, Charles Laverne Singleton, chose lethal injection, Swindler refused to select either method. By not making a choice, he automatically defaulted to electrocution, making him the last person to be executed in Arkansas's electric chair. According to Warden David White, Swindler may have intentionally chosen this path for the notoriety that came with being the final inmate executed in that manner. He also became the only person ever executed using the new electric chair that the state had built in the 1970s. Swindler did not make a final statement. News reports from the time also do not indicate that he made any special request for his last meal. Ronald Gene Simmons, June 25, 1990, lethal injection. Simmons, a former serviceman in the U.S. Navy and Air Force, became infamous as a spree killer after murdering 16 individuals during a single week in December 1987, including 14 members of his own family. The rampage, widely regarded as the deadliest case of familicide in American history, began at his home near Dover and extended to a law office, a convenience store, and his place of work. After retiring from over 20 years of military service, Simmons was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. He chose to forego all appeals and was executed by lethal injection in 1990, marking the first time Arkansas used that method of execution. Among those he killed were his own daughter, who had been a victim of his essay, and the child he fathered with her. The massacre also claimed the lives of a former colleague and an unrelated bystander, while leaving 4 other people injured. Simmons is remembered as the most lethal mass murderer in the history of Arkansas. He received death sentences in 2 separate trials and deliberately declined to challenge them through the appeals process. His final words were, "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide." His last meal was filet mignon, 2 raw onions, tomato slices, a banana, 6 rolls, and a 7-Up. Ricky Ray Rector, January 24, 1992, lethal injection. After killing a man in a restaurant, Rector went on the run for 3 days before initially agreeing to surrender to authorities. However, when the moment came to turn himself in, he instead shot and killed the police officer assigned to take him into custody. Following this, Rector attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head. His case became particularly controversial during his 1992 execution in Arkansas, drawing attention to his significant mental impairments. A widely cited example of his cognitive limitations was his decision to save the dessert from his last meal for later, an act that would have been impossible to carry out after his execution. A decade later, in 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, effectively banning such executions. For his final meal, Rector requested and was served a steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and a slice of pecan pie. As previously mentioned, he set the pie aside on his tray, telling the corrections officers escorting him to the execution chamber that he was saving it for later. The slice was not removed or discarded until after his execution. During the procedure, medical staff spent over 50 minutes attempting to locate a suitable vein for administering the lethal injection. The execution curtain remained drawn between Rector and the witnesses, but some reported hearing him moaning. The administrator of the State Department of Corrections medical program explained that the moans occurred as a team of initially 2 medical personnel, which eventually grew to 5, worked on both sides of his body trying to access a vein, and that this effort may have caused Rector's occasional outbursts. The state later attributed the difficulty in finding a vein to Rector's large body size and the effects of an antipsychotic medication he had been given. He did not have an official last statement. Stephen Douglas Hill, May 7, 1992, lethal injection. In 1984, Hill, then 18 years old, was serving a prison sentence when he and fellow inmate Michael Anthony Cox escaped during a work detail. The two men forced their way into a home in central Arkansas, restraining the occupants and stealing firearms and a truck before moving on to another nearby residence. Law enforcement quickly surrounded the second house, and during the confrontation, State Police investigator Robert Klein was fatally shot by a shotgun blast. Hill confessed to the crime on videotape and was subsequently sentenced to death for Klein's murder. Cox, who received an 86-year prison sentence for related offenses, later claimed that he, not Hill, had fired the fatal shot. However, state prosecutors, a federal judge, and the state parole board have all expressed skepticism about Cox's claim, noting that he has changed his account multiple times. Hill was pronounced dead at 9:10 p.m., 8 minutes after he had been injected with the drugs. At the time of his execution, 25-year-old Hill made several statements in his final moments. He expressed remorse to the family of his victim, apologizing for the suffering he had caused. He also sought forgiveness from his own family. In a final comment, Hill said, "I would like everyone who's rooting for this to know that they're going to have to go home and live with it." He refused the final special meal. Jonas Houghton Whitmore, May 11, 1994, lethal injection. Whitmore was found guilty of murdering Essie Mae Black, a 62-year-old woman who had welcomed him into her Mount Ida home in August 1986 despite being a stranger. After offering him milk and cookies, she was violently attacked. She was stabbed 10 times, her throat was slashed, and the neck was carved into her right cheek. In addition to the assault, Whitmore stole $250 from the home. During his trial, Whitmore claimed that he had suffered a flashback to his childhood essay while inside Mrs. Black's residence. There is no record of a final statement or specific last meal request. His execution by lethal injection occurred just 1 hour before that of another man, Edward Pickens. It was the first time Arkansas executed 2 people on the same day since the U.S. Supreme Court allowed states to restore the death penalty in 1976. Edward Charles Pickens, May 11, 1994, lethal injection. Pickens was convicted of the October 1975 murder of Wesley Noble, a 76-year-old retired farmer. According to witnesses, Noble begged for his life before being shot during an armed robbery at a grocery store in Casco. Pickens, who was just 21 years old at the time, was one of 3 men from Detroit involved in the crime, which also resulted in the death of a second man, injuries to 5 others, and the essay of a woman. The perpetrators stole both money and jewelry from the victims. Pickens's 2 accomplices were also convicted of capital murder. Antonio Clark received a death sentence but was serving a life term in Michigan for an unrelated crime, while Vincent Gooch pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. According to a prison spokesman, before his execution, Pickens thanked the ministers and said goodbye to a fellow inmate. He added, "He said he loved them all, to keep up the good work, keep up the struggle." Before his execution, Pickens also issued a written statement admitting he helped in the robbery, but denying he killed the victim. There is no record of his final meal. Hoyt Franklin Kleins, Daryl V. Richley, James William Holmes, August 3, 1994, lethal injection. Donald Lemon, along with his wife Virginia and their daughter Vicky, was at home when 4 masked men rang the doorbell and forcibly entered the house. The intruders shot Lemon 3 times and brutally beat him in front of his family using a motorcycle drive chain. They then stole more than $1,000 in cash and several guns, according to court records. The suspects, Holmes, Richley, Kleins, and Michael Orndorff, were apprehended later that same day. They were tried together for capital murder and aggravated robbery, and all were initially convicted and sentenced to death. Orndorff's death sentence was later overturned on appeal, and Lemon's family agreed to a life sentence in his case. The remaining 3 men were executed one after the other on August 3, 1994, marking the first triple execution in the U.S. since the modern death penalty was reinstated following Gregg v. Georgia. None of the 3 men chose to make final statements. Clines was declared dead at 7:11 p.m. 58 minutes later, Richley was pronounced dead on the same gurney, and Holmes followed at 9:24 p.m. For his last meal, Hoyt Franklin Clines had a hamburger and a Pepsi. Richley's last meal consisted of a rare porterhouse steak, extra sharp cheese, a salad with blue cheese dressing, and a root beer. For his last meal prior to his execution, Holmes chose hickory smoked beef sausage alongside slices of Cracker Barrel cheese, a Wendy's double cheeseburger loaded with pickles, onions, lettuce, and mayonnaise, French fries served with ketchup, a whole onion, and a kosher pickle. For dessert, he requested a Breyer's Viennetta, a combination of ice cream and cake, and a Coca-Cola. Richard Wayne Snell, April 19, 1995, lethal injection. On November 3, 1983, Snell, a known white supremacist, entered a pawn shop in Arkansas with William Thomas and Stephen Scott and fatally shot the owner, William Stump, mistakenly believing him to be Jewish. While Thomas remained outside, Scott accompanied Snell inside during the attack. Several months later, on June 30, 1984, Snell murdered Arkansas State Trooper Lewis Bryant. After the shooting, Snell fled across the Oklahoma state line, where a truck driver who witnessed the incident notified the Broken Bow police. Officers there set up a roadblock and confronted Snell, engaging in a shootout that left him shot 6 times, with injuries to his abdomen, knee, and ankle. Snell was apprehended and returned to Arkansas for trial, where he was convicted of Bryant's murder and sentenced to life in prison, and also received a death sentence for the murder of Stump. Snell did not contest or deny the crimes for which he was charged. As part of a deal to testify against Snell, Thomas pleaded guilty to a federal racketeering charge and was sentenced to 12 years in prison, to be served concurrently with other sentences in Missouri and federal courts. In 1987, Scott pleaded guilty to a non-capital first-degree murder charge and received a 30-year prison sentence with 15 years suspended. In his final moments before execution, Snell directed his last words toward then-Governor Jim Guy Tucker. He began by saying, "Well, I had a lot to say, but you have me at an inconvenience. My mind is blurred, but I'm going to say a couple of words." He then issued a chilling warning to the governor, declaring, "Governor Tucker, look over your shoulder. Justice is coming. I wouldn't trade places with you or any of your cronies. Hell has victories. I am at peace." For his last meal, Richard Wayne Snell requested a simple meal of Southern cooking: fried crappie, hush puppies, a salad with blue cheese dressing, and a large white onion. Barry Lee Fairchild, August 31, 1995, lethal injection. Fairchild was taken into custody for the February 26, 1983 abduction, essay, and murder of Marjorie Greta Mason, a 22-year-old nurse in the U.S. Air Force, after police received tips from a confidential informant linking him and his brother to the crime. During his trial, Fairchild retracted his 2 videotaped confessions, asserting that Pulaski County Sheriff Tommy Robinson and Chief Deputy Larry Dill had physically assaulted him and threatened to kill him unless he confessed, and that they had coached him prior to recording the second confession. His defense attorneys argued that Fairchild was mentally impaired and lacked the ability to discern right from wrong. He was ultimately convicted on August 2, 1983, and received a death sentence. Fairchild made no final statement before his execution by lethal injection. He also declined the last meal. Fairchild remarked that getting a last meal before an execution was pointless. It's just like putting gas in a car that don't have no motor. William Frank Parker, August 8, 1996, lethal injection. Parker was executed in Arkansas for the murder of his former wife's parents, whom he blamed for the collapse of his marriage. On November 5, 1984, under the influence of alcohol and cocaine, and consumed by anger over his recent divorce, Parker killed his former in-laws in their home in Rogers, Arkansas. He subsequently kidnapped his ex-wife and drove her to a police station where he shot her and also wounded a police officer 3 times before being overpowered and disarmed. Parker, who had adopted the name Sifu, meaning teacher in Chinese, received public support from prominent figures including the Dalai Lama, who sent a letter opposing his execution, and Dr. Richard Gere, a fellow Buddhist who had intended to visit him on death row. However, the Arkansas Department of Corrections denied Gere's request, citing insufficient time to conduct a background check. In his final statement, 42-year-old Parker expressed his Buddhist faith, saying, "I seek refuge in the Buddha, I seek refuge in the Dharma, I seek refuge in the Sangha." There are no records of his final meal. Paul Ruiz and Earl Von Denton, January 8, 1997, lethal injection. Ruiz and Denton were initially serving life sentences at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary when they escaped on June 23, 1977. Over the following 2 weeks, the pair carried out a series of murders across Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas. They were charged with killing Melvin Short in Oklahoma, followed by the alleged murders of Jimmy Cockrell, Ray Jones, and Alton Wilson in Louisiana. In Arkansas, they were accused of murdering Marshal Marvin Ritchie of the Magazine Police Department and Park Ranger Opal Lee James. Additionally, they were suspected in the 1977 disappearance and presumed murder of Gerald Tiffey in Oklahoma. Ruiz and Denton were eventually apprehended in Portland, Oregon, and extradited to Arkansas to face capital murder charges for the deaths of Ritchie and James. They were convicted and sentenced to death by Arkansas courts in 1978, although they were never tried for the other murders they had committed in Oklahoma and Louisiana. On January 8, 1997, Paul Ruiz, 49, and Earl Von Denton, 47, were executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Arkansas. On that same day, 30-year-old Kurt Douglas Wainwright was also executed at the same facility. We're going to talk about him in a minute. This event represented the second and most recent triple execution carried out in Arkansas on a single day. Neither Denton nor Ruiz made any final statements before their executions. For his last meal, Ruiz chose to eat a Caesar salad, while Denton declined to request a final meal. Kurt Douglas Wainwright, January 8, 1997, lethal injection. He was found guilty of murdering Barbara Smith, a clerk at the Best Stop convenience store in Prescott, Arkansas, during a robbery on July 29, 1988. During the crime, Smith handed over all the money she had, knelt on the floor, and was then shot behind the ear. Although no one directly witnessed the shooting, bystanders saw Wainwright fleeing the store and getting into a pink Cadillac. Police later located and stopped the vehicle, which was being driven by Andrew Woods with Dennis Sleeper in the front passenger seat. Wainwright was in the back seat in possession of a Best Stop money bag containing cash and a firearm. All three men were charged with capital murder. During the trial, the state argued that Wainwright had entered the store alone and carried out the robbery and murder, while Leeper and Woods remained in the car. Wainwright, however, claimed that Leeper had fired the fatal shot. After reviewing the evidence, an Arkansas jury convicted Wainwright of capital felony murder. Andrew Woods was acquitted and released. Dennis Leeper received a 17-year prison sentence for aggravated robbery through a plea deal. Wainwright had no special last meal and no final words. Eugene Wallace Perry, August 6, 1997, lethal injection. On the evening of September 10, 1980, Kenneth Staten and his daughter, Suzanne Ware, were discovered bound and gagged in the back of the Staten Jewelry Store in Van Buren, Arkansas, where they both worked. Both had been executed with 2 close-range gunshots to the head. Approximately $100,000 worth of jewelry and watches had been stolen from the store. In 1981, Perry was convicted of capital felony murder in connection with these deaths and sentenced to death. Perry had claimed that another death row inmate, Marion Pruitt, was the true perpetrator. Although Pruitt later confessed to the murders, the courts dismissed the confession and upheld Perry's conviction. Perry delivered an unusual final statement, much of it spoken in a chant-like manner, declaring, "I am innocent of this crime. I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha." For his last meal, served at 5:16 p.m., he requested a large pizza, banana pudding with meringue topping, root beer, and peanut M&Ms. Outside the prison, 5 protesters, including 2 of Perry's daughters and a girlfriend, demonstrated, asserting his innocence. Wilburn Henderson, July 8, 1998, lethal injection. Henderson, a career criminal with a long record and a history of mental illness, was convicted for the murder of Willa Dean O'Neill on November 26, 1980. O'Neill and her husband Bob owned a used furniture store in Fort Smith, Texas. During a robbery at the store, Henderson shot and killed Willa Dean, escaping with just $41. According to prosecutors, prior to the murder, Henderson had checked a .22 caliber pistol out of a pawn shop and later returned it there. Although the weapon was suspected to be the murder weapon, ballistics experts were unable to conclusively match it to the fatal shooting. When asked if he had any final words before his execution, Henderson declared, "Yes, sir, I'm an innocent man. God forgive you for what you do." Henderson could not actually be linked to the murder scene, and he said he was on the opposite side of the state when the killing happened, a statement that was backed up by his wife. It seems like he was in fact innocent. Willa's husband Bob was supposedly the real murderer, upset that his wife was considering the possibility of divorce because of his abusive behavior. Right after the murder, both Willa Dean O'Neill's daughter and her stepdaughter, children from earlier marriages, told investigators they believed Bob O'Neill might have been involved. Court documents and later interviews revealed that just a day before the killing, Bob O'Neill had asked Glenda Fleetwood, Willa Dean's daughter, where her mother would prefer to be buried. There are no records of Henderson's last meal. Johnny Michael Cox, February 16, 1999, lethal injection. Cox, 42, was executed in Arkansas after being convicted of a triple homicide that included the murder of his own step-grandmother. On November 1, 1989, All Saints' Day, a date he had ominously highlighted in red on his calendar, Cox killed 68-year-old Marie Sullins, 68-year-old Margaret Brown, and 32-year-old Billy Brown in White County, located in northeast Arkansas. When asked if he wished to make any final remarks before his execution, Cox simply replied, "Yes, I'm anxious. Please release me and let me go." He was declared dead at 9:11 p.m., roughly 10 minutes after the lethal injection was administered. Investigators were never able to determine a clear motive behind the murders. He stabbed, strangled, and shot them before burning their house down with their bodies still inside. The only explanation Cox ever offered was that he chose to kill his 3 victims on All Saints' Day because he wanted to send them to heaven. 2 relatives of the victims were present to witness his execution, but after the procedure was carried out, they left the prison grounds without offering any public comment. There is no record of his final meal. Marion Albert Pruitt, April 12, 1999, lethal injection. Marion Pruitt's killing spree spanned multiple states and left a trail of brutal murders behind him. On September 17, 1981, he kidnapped Peggy Lowe during a robbery at the Metro Center branch of UniFirst Bank, later known as Trustmark National Bank, in Jackson, Mississippi, where Lowe worked. He murdered her shortly afterward. In addition to that crime, Pruitt was responsible for the deaths of Bobby Jean Robertson, a convenience store clerk in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and 2 Colorado clerks, Anthony Tate and James Balderson. For these crimes, he received the death penalty twice, once for Lowe's murder and again for Robertson's, as well as 2 life sentences for the Colorado killings. Earlier that same year, on March 2, 1981, Pruitt stood trial in New Mexico for the murder of his common-law wife, Pamela Sue Barker, who also went by Michelle Lynn Pearson. During the trial, Pruitt admitted to robbing her to fund his staggering $4,000 a week cocaine addiction, but denied killing her. Barker had been beaten to death and then set on fire. Despite his denial, he was convicted and handed a 3rd life sentence. While on death row, Pruitt's manipulative tendencies continued. He contacted a Mississippi newspaper demanding $20,000 in exchange for information about the location of Barker's missing engagement ring. He also offered to disclose the location of another victim's body in Florida, but only if he were granted a paid appearance in the Geraldo talk show. His last dinner included a stuffed crust pizza from Pizza Hut, 4 Burger King Whoppers, a large serving of French fries, 3 2-liter bottles of Pepsi, a bucket of ice, a bottle of ketchup, salt, fried eggplant, fried squash, fried okra, and a pecan pie. In a final interview before his execution, Pruitt revealed that his original request had been roast duck, but the prison authorities denied it, explaining that they would not prepare such a meal. There are no records of his final words. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.